So if you were to just step outside, completely naked, into a Pleistocene winter night, your body would basically begin to fail almost immediately.
Oh, absolutely. Instantly.
Yeah, like it wouldn't be this gradual decline. It would be a total catastrophic cascade of thermal failure. Your blood vessels would violently constrict, right, just trying to hoard whatever warmth is left in your core, completely abandoning your extremities to frostbite.
Right, the body just goes into pure triage mode.
Exactly. Your metabolism spikes, your muscles start contracting into these violent shivers just to generate heat. And within, what, a few hours?
No.
Your glycogen stores would just burn out.
Yeah, the engine simply runs out of fuel.
But the crazy thing is, roughly 50,000 years ago, hominins, we're basically hairless, tropical apes, wandered right into the sub-zero winds of the northern hemisphere and survived this exact scenario.
Yeah.
And often without even the ability to reliably kindle a fire.
Which is just wild to think about. It forces us to completely reevaluate our entire understanding of resilience. Because today, we look at the cold as, an inconvenience, something we just banish by turning a dial on a thermostat. But back in the deep ice age, the cold wasn't an inconvenience. It was an omnipresent apex predator.
Wow, an apex predator. That's a great way to put it.
It was an environmental force so absolute that it literally dictated the thermodynamic properties of proteins, the structural mechanics of bone, and even the fundamental cognitive architecture of early human behavior.
And that is exactly what we're unraveling today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are pulling together this incredibly diverse stack of sources, dense paleontology wikis, middle Paleolithic archaeological site reports, deep dive mathematical models of hominin thermoregulation and atmospheric physics.
And a lot of data.
It is a massive amount of data. So to process all of this without just overwhelming you, we're going to do something special. We aren't just going to list off facts. We're going to construct a continuous, immersive timeline. We're building a 12-hour chronological journey right in your mind, progressing minute by minute, basically, from dusk until dawn on the frozen Earth.
Yeah, and we'll be blending that rigorous, granular scientific analysis with deep, repeated sensory details. The goal here is to slow down the pace of information. We want you to not just understand the biomechanics and the archaeology, but to really feel the environment.
Right.
We're going to isolate the specific physiological and behavioral miracles that kept the megafauna and our ancestors alive while the entire world just froze around them.
Okay, let's unpack this. The timeline begins at dusk. Let's orient ourselves in the environment first.
Good idea.
The sun is just starting to scrape the horizon, and it's casting these incredibly long, pale blue shadows across the Earth. We are roughly 25,000 years in the past, and, if you look at the popular cultural depiction of the Ice Age, you usually see this monolithic snow globe.
Oh yeah, the classic blizzard everywhere.
Right. Just endless, blinding white blizzards from the equator to the poles. But looking at the atmospheric physics in the sources, that paints a radically different and, frankly, much harsher picture. If I'm understanding the climatic models correctly, precipitation was actually incredibly rare in these regions.
Yeah, that is the great paradox of a glacial maximum. The northern hemisphere was dominated by this colossal biome known as the mammoth steppe.
The mammoth steppe.
Right. And it wasn't a glacier. It was the largest continuous grassland in the history of the planet. It stretched all the way from Western Europe across the entirety of Siberia, over the exposed Bering Land Bridge, and deep into North America.
That's just a staggering amount of land.
It is, and you are entirely correct about the precipitation, because millions of cubic miles of the Earth's water were locked up in these massive Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets. Global humidity basically plummeted.
So if the water is trapped in ice a mile thick, it's obviously not evaporating into the atmosphere to form storm clouds.
Precisely. You essentially have a global drought. And furthermore, the immense weight and movement of those glaciers acted like a continental grinding stone.
Right, just crushing everything underneath.
Exactly. They pulverized the bedrock beneath them into this microscopic, flour-like powder known as Lewis. And because there was very little snow to pack this dust down, the incredibly high-pressure weather systems rolling off the glaciers generated constant, howling, katabatic winds.
Okay, so I want you to really listen to the environment shifting around you. There is no gentle snowfall here. Instead, you hear a constant, aggressive hissing sound. It's the wind moving across an endless expanse of tough, low-growing sagebrush and sedge grasses. The air is so devastatingly dry and cold that every inhalation feels abrasive against the back of your throat.
Yeah, it hurts to breathe.
Exactly. And the wind carries this fine grip, the lowest dust, just stinging your exposed skin. And then Cutting through the hiss of the wind, you feel a deep, rhythmic vibration in the frozen ground beneath your feet. You hear the resonant scraping of ivory moving through the dry brush, and emerging through the twilight is a herd of woolly mammoths.
The mammoths primigenius.
My kings of the steppe.
Truly. To survive in an environment that regularly dropped into the negative 30s and 40s, they evolved adaptations that go way, way beyond just growing a shaggy coat. Though, to be fair, the coat itself is a marvel of thermal insulation.
Oh, for sure. The sources mention those guard hairs.
Right, they possess long guard hairs, some of them nearly a meter in length, that shed moisture and wind. But beneath that was a densely packed undercoat, and this undercoat functioned by trapping a stagnant boundary layer of air right against the skin, which prevented the convective heat loss that the wind was constantly trying to force.
But, insulation only retains heat, right? It doesn't actually generate it. I was reading through the physiological breakdowns, and the adaptation that fundamentally shifts our understanding of their biology happens at the cellular level. It's a structure called a lipoplex.
Yes, the lipoplexes. When we think of fat on a large marine mammal, like, say, a walrus, we think of blubber, which is this uniform subcutaneous layer.
It's just a thick layer all over.
Right, but the mammoths developed something much more specialized. Lipoplexes were highly vascularized, massive deposits of brown-like fat concentrated specifically in their neck and the massive hump on their withers.
So not just passive insulation.
Exactly. This wasn't passive. This was a highly dynamic thermal battery. During the incredibly brief, explosive summers of the steppe, they gorged on vegetation, packing energy into these lipoplexes. Then, in the dead of winter, their bodies could trigger complex metabolic pathways to break down these specific fat stores.
To generate heat.
Yes, generating internal metabolic heat precisely around their central nervous system and core organs.
Okay, that makes perfect biological sense for the core. But what about the extremities? I mean, my mind immediately goes to the thermodynamics of blood flow.
Right, the trunk and legs.
Yeah. If a mammal is standing in sub-zero winds, the blood pumping down into its legs or its tail or its trunk is going to get flash chilled. In a modern human or even a modern African elephant, if tissue temperatures plummet like that, the hemoglobin in the blood undergoes a conformational change that basically locks the oxygen away.
The affinity spikes.
Right. The hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen spikes. It refuses to offload it to the surrounding tissue. The tissue dies and you get frostbite.
And that is exactly where the evolutionary brilliance of the mammoth genome reveals itself. Paleogeneticists have actually successfully resurrected mammoth hemoglobin.
Wait, really? Like in a lab?
Yes. By synthesizing their DNA and inserting it into modern E. coli bacteria, they were able to observe how it functions. And they discovered 3 distinct, highly targeted amino acid mutations in the beta and delta chains of the mammoth hemoglobin protein.
Wow. So they essentially recoded the software of their own red blood cells.
They absolutely did.
Right.
Normally, cold temperatures stabilize the bonds between hemoglobin and oxygen, but these specific mutations destabilized those bonds. They acted as a literal biochemical antifreeze.
That is incredible.
Because of these 3 minor structural shifts, mammoth hemoglobin could successfully offload oxygen to muscle and skin tissue even when the ambient temperature of that extremity was near freezing.
So that's how they kept their trunks from falling off.
Exactly. It allowed them to keep a massive, heavily vascularized appendage, like their trunk, fully functional and oxygenated in conditions that would cause a modern elephant's trunk to just necrotize and fall off.
And the trunk is so critical because, as the sources point out, looking at the Sangha-Yurak and the Yucca mammoth specimens, they used it in ways we never even anticipated.
The structural details are fascinating.
Yeah. The very tip of the trunk was relatively hairless, packed with nerve endings for tactile foraging. But right above that sensitive tip, the trunk flared out into a distinct, heavily furred expansion. It functioned exactly like a built-in pocket.
Yeah, the behavioral implication of that is just fascinating.
I can imagine.
When the wind chill dropped to critical levels, they could simply curl the bare, sensitive tip of their trunk up and tuck it right into this fur-lined expansion, basically wrapping it in its own thermal blanket.
Like a human blowing into a fur mitten?
Precisely. And they needed that tip to be perfectly functional because it was their primary tool for manipulating the tough, abrasive steppe grasses.
Which honestly brings up a massive caloric dilemma. If you have an animal that weighs up to, 8 or 9 tons, and it's...
Right, the caloric math is intense. It required them to be in constant motion. And the amazing thing is, we aren't just guessing about their migration patterns. We actually know exactly where they walked, thanks to advanced mass spectrometry and isotopic analysis of their dental enamel.
I find this methodology so stunning. How does a piece of mammoth tooth pulled from the permafrost in Poland act as a geographical GPS tracker?
It relies on the physics of radioactive decay in geology. So, bedrock contains trace amounts of an element called strontium. Specifically, there are two isotopes, strontium-87 and strontium-86.
Okay.
The ratio of these two isotopes varies dramatically depending on the age and the type of the rock. As groundwater flows through the bedrock, it absorbs that specific isotopic signature. The grasses absorb the water, and then the mammoth eats the grasses.
Wow, so the landscape literally embeds its chemical signature right into the mammoth's food supply.
Exactly. And mammoth teeth grow incrementally, layer by layer, much like the rings of a tree. The dentin and the enamel mineralize, capturing the specific strontium ratio of the food they ate that week.
That's unbelievable.
It really is. Furthermore, the oxygen isotopes in the tooth can tell us the ambient temperature of the water they were drinking. So by taking a cross-section of a tusk or a molar, scientists can read a chronological diary of the animal's entire life.
And what did the Polish data show?
The data from the Polish Midlands shows intense seasonal migrations. They were moving continuously, retreating to sheltered valleys in the south during the darkest winter months, and marching vast distances onto the open plains to capitalize on the summer growth.
So they were constantly chasing the caloric horizon. But I suppose by moving constantly, they were inadvertently doing the planetary landscaping, right? By churning the lowest soil with their immense weight, tearing up dead sedge, and fertilizing the ground, they prevented mosses and tundra scrub from taking over. They were basically the biological engines that kept the entire mammoth steppe biome productive.
Yeah, they engineered the very ecosystem that sustained them. It's a perfect feedback loop. But as the pale light finally vanishes and the deep dusk settles in, we have to shift our perspective.
Right, because the mammoths are fun.
Yeah, they are equipped with internal metabolic furnaces and antifreeze blood.
Right.
But what about us?
Okay, the timeline moves forward. We are transitioning from dusk into the late evening. The temperature is in an absolute freefall. We are leaving the massive biology-driven resilience of the mammoth behind, and we are stepping into the realm of behavioral engineering.
This is where it gets really human.
Yeah. We are shifting our focus to a specific archaeological site in southern Jordan, the Torfaraj Rock Shelter.
Torfaraj provides such a vital window into the Middle Paleolithic. We're specifically looking at a period dating between 49,000 and 69,000 years ago. The hominins occupying this space were archaic humans, likely Neanderthals, utilizing Levantine Mousterian stone tool technologies.
Okay.
And Torfaraj is a cornerstone site because it systematically dismantles one of the most pervasive and frankly insulting biases in paleoanthropology.
Well, you're talking about the deeply entrenched stereotype of the disorganized caveman. The assumption that before modern Homo sapiens, human ancestors were just haphazardly wandering through the landscape, dropping their garbage wherever they sat, with absolutely no capacity for spatial organization.
Yeah, it was an assumption born of arrogance, really, not data. The meticulous spatial analysis conducted at Torfaraj proves that Neanderthals possessed a highly sophisticated, entirely modern capacity for cognitive mapping and architectural organization. They didn't build walls of stone, but they built rigid walls of behavior.
I love that phrase, walls of behavior. Okay, I want you to feel the transition in the environment right now. You have just walked miles across the abrasive, wind-scoured plains. You step out of the dark, howling wind and cross the threshold of the Torfaraj shelter.
The relief would be instant.
Instant. The oppressive noise of the wind just cuts out, the air pressure stabilizes. You are hit by the heavy, rich smell of wood smoke and rendering fat. And as your eyes adjust to the gloom, you see the massive glowing core of a central domestic fire. But looking past it, hugging the rough golden sandstone of the cave's back wall, you see a perfectly spaced line of smaller, glowing embers.
That line of smaller fires is an absolute masterclass in Pleistocene thermodynamics. Archaeologists uncovered a distinct row of sleeping hearths, located precisely 0.8 to 1.5 meters from the back wall of the shelter.
That's a very specific distance.
It is, and that precise measurement is not an accident. It is a calculated microclimate.
Let's look at the physics of that. I mean, why not sleep right next to the massive central fire? Why go to the trouble to build tiny fires near the back wall?
Because a massive central fire throws off an immense amount of radiant heat, sure, but it also generates choking clouds of particulate smoke, and it pulls in cold air from the cave entrance just to feed its combustion.
Oh, right, the draft.
Yeah, it's chaotic. By placing small, manageable fires roughly a meter from the sandstone wall, The Neanderthals were exploiting the specific heat capacity of the rock. The sandstone absorbs the thermal radiation from the fires and slowly re-radiates it backward.
Creating a radiant heat sandwich? The fire warms you from the front, the stone wall warms you from the back?
Exactly. And just as importantly, the positioning interacts with the cave's natural draft. The airflow entering the shelter naturally travels along the ceiling, cooling the upper space, but it creates a gentle convection current that pulls the smoke from those small back wall fires up and away from the floor.
That is brilliant.
They engineered a narrow, perfectly heated, completely smoke-free corridor specifically designed for sleeping.
It is literally localized HVAC engineering, just without the ductwork. But they weren't just sleeping on the bare dirt, were they? The sources detail a remarkable preservation of microscopic evidence that tells us exactly what they were sleeping on. I'm talking about phytoliths.
Ah, yes. Phytoliths are one of the most crucial yet invisible tools in modern archaeology.
Explain how they work.
Well, when a plant absorbs groundwater, it also absorbs soluble silica from the soil. The plant deposits this biogenic silica into its cellular structure to provide rigidity. When the plant eventually dies, decays, or is burned in a hearth, all the organic carbon burns away. But those microscopic silica skeletons, the phytoliths, they survive.
So they're like little glass fossils.
They are essentially inorganic glass casts of the plant cells, and they can remain perfectly preserved in the soil for tens of thousands of years.
And because different families of plants have different cellular shapes, a phytolith acts as a microscopic fingerprint.
Precisely. And when archaeologists sampled the soil directly in that narrow corridor between the sleeping hearths and the back wall, they found massive, localized concentrations of monocot phytoliths.
Okay, what does that mean in terms of plants?
Monocots include grasses and sedges. So this silica data proves definitively that Neanderthals were actively harvesting massive bundles of dry grasses, bringing them into the shelter, and constructing dense, insulated bedding.
Wow. They were building mattresses to insulate their bodies from the conductive heat loss of the frozen cave floor. But the phytoliths from Torforage gave us another massive revelation too, right? This one surrounding their diet.
Yes. In the central domestic area, away from the sleeping quarters, the phytolith assemblages completely changed. They found dense concentrations of dicot wood phytoliths, indicating the burning of specific hardwoods for the main fire. But deeply embedded within that ash matrix, they discovered the phytoliths of the date palm.
Which completely challenges the entire hyper-carnivore narrative. I mean, for decades, the assumption was that Ice Age hominins survived almost exclusively on mammoth steaks and bison marrow.
Well, the isotope data from many European Neanderthals does show heavily meat-based diets, simply because the tundra offered so little vegetation. But Torforage proves their behavioral flexibility. They were actively exploiting local plant resources. Finding date palm phytoliths alongside intact starch grains and charred seed husks is the earliest known evidence of humans processing and consuming dates anywhere in the world.
That's amazing.
They were roasting seeds, rendering fat, and managing a complex omnivorous diet right around that central hearth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as the evening progresses, we see how they partitioned the rest of their space. The spatial mapping of thousands of tiny flint chips the debitage left over from making stone tools revealed 4 distinct activity zones, labeled areas A, B, C, and D. They physically separated their tasks.
The lithic analysis here is stunning. In Area D, which was located much closer to the cave mouth and the drip line, archaeologists found evidence of initial core preparation.
Heavy work.
Yeah, this is the heavy percussive work of taking a raw flint nodule and striking it with a hard hammerstone to strip away the useless outer cortex. It generates massive, sharp, chaotic shards of rock. It makes perfect sense to do this near the entrance, away from where people are walking barefoot or sitting.
It's the messy utility room. You don't chop firewood in your bedroom.
Exactly. Area D also contained massive dumps of excess ash cleared from the hearths. But when you move deeper into the shelter, into areas A and B near the central fire, the debris changes completely.
What did they find there?
Here, the flint flakes are microscopic. They are the result of soft hammer percussion, using bone or antler to delicately chip the edges of a level-law point to perfectly resharpen it. This area also contained butchering marks on bone fragments and tools specifically designed for scraping hides.
So they had designated spatial architecture without walls. A kitchen, a workshop, a sleeping corridor, and all of it invisible to the naked eye until you mapped the microscopic debris.
It demonstrates a cognitive template. They walked into a bare rock shelter and immediately imposed a structured, organized map of human behavior right onto the dirt.
Okay, the timeline shifts again. The flint napping has stopped. The butchered meat and roasted dates are consumed. The heavy domestic fire is banked down to a pile of slowly pulsing coals. The hominins retreat to their grass beds along the back wall. We cross the threshold into the deepest phase of the night. It is midnight.
The winds outside typically drop during these hours, leaving a terrifying absolute stillness. And without the wind to mix the atmospheric layers, the cold just settles. The ambient temperature plunges to its lowest point in the 24-hour cycle.
This brings us to a massive physiological conundrum presented in the sources, because the models we are looking at focus on hominin survival during a very specific chronological window. Marine isotope stages 14 through 11. We are talking about a period stretching from roughly 500,000 to 400,000 years ago.
Right.
The Neanderthals at Torforage, they had established hearths. But if we push further back to the hominins entering Europe during this earlier deep freeze, the archaeological record for fire is incredibly sparse.
It is one of the most hotly debated topics in paleoanthropology. While there are isolated instances of burnt material, the evidence for the habitual, controlled kindling of fire on demand in Europe before 300,000 years ago is highly controversial.
So they couldn't just rub sticks together whenever they wanted.
It is highly probable that these hominins relied on capturing opportunistic fire from lightning strikes or brush fires.
Meaning they could not guarantee a warm hearth every single night. If a storm put their fire out, they might have to survive weeks of sub-zero midnights relying purely on their own bodies. So to understand if that was even possible, researchers built a thermodynamic heat loss model.
And the math behind this model is brutal.
Oh, I bet.
To understand the deficit, we have to establish the human baseline.
Yep.
A modern, naked human, resting horizontally, achieves thermal equilibrium, meaning their basal metabolic rate generates exactly enough heat to match the heat lost to the environment at an ambient temperature of roughly 27 degrees Celsius, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
This is our thermoneutral zone.
Right. Anything below 80 degrees, and a naked body has to start doing physiological work to avoid cooling down. But these hominins were facing ambient temperatures dropping well below freezing. So if we rule out reliable fire kindling based on the timeline, that leaves us with a severe thermodynamic deficit.
Wait, my mind immediately goes to sheer mass, the walrus strategy we talked about earlier. If hominins just bulked up their subcutaneous fat, say, 2 or 3 centimeters thick, wouldn't that trap enough radiant heat to survive the night?
It's a logical assumption, and the model explicitly tested it. They simulated a hominin with 3 centimeters of subcutaneous fat covering its entire body.
Which is a lot of fat.
A level of adiposity that would equate to severe clinical obesity in modern clinical terms. The physics of fat as an insulator are decent, but a hominin is not a sphere. We have long, surface area heavy limbs.
Too much area to lose heat from.
Exactly. The mathematical model demonstrated that even with a massive layer of fat, a naked hominin completely protected from the wind would still suffer a fatal drop in core body temperature before sunrise. Fat alone wasn't enough to trap the heat. So if insulation fails, you have to increase the heat production. Does the body just resort to shivering all night? Could you actually sleep while shivering?
Well, shivering is the body's ultimate emergency furnace. When your core temperature drops, your hypothalamus triggers asynchronous involuntary muscle contractions. This mechanical friction and the breakdown of ATP within the muscle fibers can increase your heat production by a factor of 4 or 5.
But the physiological cost of shivering is exorbitant.
It is completely unsustainable. Shivering rapidly depletes your intramuscular glycogen, the stored carbohydrates your muscles use for fuel. Even a highly conditioned human can only sustain maximal shivering for a couple of hours before the glycogen is exhausted.
And then what?
The muscles simply fatigue and fail. You absolutely cannot sustain shivering for a 12-hour Pleistocene night. And the violent muscular contractions prevent you from achieving the deep restorative stages of sleep. You wake up exhausted, metabolically drained, and basically freeze.
What about the brown fat we mentioned earlier with the mammoths? Humans have that too, right? Non-shivering thermogenesis.
Yes. Brown adipose tissue, or BAT. Unlike white fat, which stores energy, brown fat is packed with iron-rich mitochondria. These mitochondria contain a unique protein called uncoupling protein 1, or UCP1. Normally, mitochondria use the energy from food to create ATP, the cellular currency of energy. UCP1 short-circuits this process.
How so?
It allows protons to leak back across the mitochondrial membrane without creating ATP, and that trapped kinetic energy is released directly as pure heat.
So it's a built-in biochemical radiator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In cold-adapted populations today, and certainly Pleistocene hominins, possessed higher volumes of active BAT. But the thermodynamic model ran the numbers on this too. To survive the absolute cold of an ice age midnight at minus 20 degrees Celsius without fire, relying entirely on brown fat thermogenesis, a hominin would have to sustainably increase their basal metabolic rate, their BMR, by a factor of 2 or 3.
Which brings us back to the caloric math of the mammoth. If your BMR triples, you have to eat 3 times as many calories every single day just to keep your internal radiator running hot enough to survive the night.
You're finding 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day in a frozen, resource-scarce winter landscape is virtually impossible for a hominin. So the biology alone, the subcutaneous fat, the shivering, the metabolic spikes of brown fat, it was not going to ensure survival. The math simply did not work.
So what did they do?
The true lifesaver was a behavioral intervention. The absolute simplest piece of technology imaginable.
A blanket.
An animal fur bed cover. The physiological model calculated the thermal resistance, the R value of a simple animal pelt approximately 5 centimeters thick. We're not talking about complex, tailored Inuit parkas here, just a raw, untailored hide draped over a sleeping group of hominins.
And what did the addition of a 5-centimeter pelt do to the math?
It altered the thermodynamic equation completely. By introducing that simple barrier, it trapped a thick boundary layer of stagnant air directly against the hominin skin. The data shows that this single behavioral adaptation allowed humans to endure ambient temperatures as low as negative 16.5 to negative 25 degrees Celsius while maintaining thermal equilibrium at their normal resting metabolic rate.
Wow.
No shivering required.
Rest in this moment. The heavy, dense weight of a mammoth or bison hide is pressing down on your shoulders. The sleeping fire nearby has burned down to a single pulsing red ember. The air outside the shelter entrance is so sharp and brittle it feels almost crystalline. You pull the rough fur up over your face. Underneath the pelt, the microclimate is perfectly regulated. You focus on the slow, rhythmic breathing of the group huddled together next to you, pooling your collective radiant heat, insulated by the stolen fur of the giants. You are surviving the absolute darkest, coldest hour of the planet.
It is a profound moment of human endurance. The hominins are asleep, their metabolisms burning slowly, safely insulated from the physics of the cold. But out on the steppe, the night is far from asleep.
Oh, definitely.
Darkness is teeming with biological activity.
The timeline progresses. It is 3:00 a.m. The wind remains completely still. A terrifying, eerie silence blankets the frost-covered plains. And moving silently through the deep, dry brush are the apex predators of the Machaerodontinae subfamily.
Yes.
The saber-toothed cats.
To understand these creatures, we have to immediately discard the most pervasive myth about them. The term saber-toothed tiger is completely scientifically inaccurate.
Because they weren't tigers.
Right. They were not tigers. They belong to an entirely distinct, extinct subfamily of felines that diverged from the ancestors of modern cats, the Pantherinae, millions of years ago. There's absolutely no phylogenetic evidence to suggest they had tiger stripes, and they certainly did not hunt like modern tigers. They were a highly specialized morphological response to the megafaunal landscape of the Ice Age.
The sources dive incredibly deep into the biomechanics of their skulls. If you look at the skull of a Smilodon, the massive upper canines, the sabers, could be over 7 inches long. But my immediate question when looking at those teeth is, how do they even get them out of the way to bite something?
That is the fundamental engineering problem of the saber-tooth. A modern lion can open its jaws to a maximum angle of about 65 degrees. If a Smilodon opened its mouth 65 degrees, the tips of its massive upper canines would still extend past its lower jaw.
It literally wouldn't be able to fit a piece of meat into its mouth.
Exactly. To utilize those weapons, they had to evolve the ability to open their jaws to an astonishing 120 degrees.
A 120-degree gape. They practically had to unhinge their jaws like a python. But mammalian jaw hinges aren't built for that kind of extreme dislocation. How did their skull accommodate that geometry without just snapping the mandible?
It required a complete architectural reorganization of the skull. First, the skull was taller from top to bottom, but compressed from front to back, compared to a pantherine cat. The zygomatic arches, the cheekbones, were severely compressed inward. Furthermore, the coronoid process, the part of the lower jaw where the massive temporalis chewing muscles attach, was significantly reduced.
Okay, what does reducing that do?
This reduction allowed the jaw to swing backward freely without the bone hitting the back of the skull.
But wait, reducing the attachment point for the chewing muscles means their actual bite force?
Yeah.
The pressure they could exert just by squeezing their jaws together was surprisingly weak compared to a modern lion, right?
Yes, exactly. They could not crush bone. Their sabers, while terrifying, were actually structurally fragile, when subjected to lateral side-to-side bending forces. If a saber-tooth plunged its teeth into the bony spine of a struggling one-ton steppe bison, the violent twisting of the prey would snap the teeth right out of the cat's skull. And we do see broken and worn sabers in the fossil record, proving their lives were incredibly violent. But they had to develop a highly specific killing technique to minimize the risk to their primary weapons.
Which brings us to the gruesome mechanics of the kill. For decades, the dominant theory was that they just stabbed downward, like using a pair of ice picks to sever the spinal cord. But the sources highlight a much more biologically plausible and frankly far more terrifying method proposed by paleontologist William Eggleston, the belly-sharing hypothesis.
Right. Modern cats, like leopards or lions, generally utilize a throat clamp. They bite down on the windpipe of their prey and simply hold on for 10 to 20 minutes until the animal suffocates.
But a saber-tooth couldn't do that.
Saber-tooths could not do this.
Yeah.
Their sabers would get in the way of a clean grip, and biting into the muscular, bone-heavy neck of a struggling mega herbivore risked breaking the teeth. Eggleston proposed that they targeted the single softest, most vulnerable, and least bony region of the prey's body, the abdomen.
But wait, getting underneath a thrashing one-ton steppe bison to bite its belly sounds like a spectacular way for a cat to get its skull crushed by a hoof. How does the biomechanics of their skeleton support taking that kind of risk?
The answer lies in their postcranial skeleton. Species like Homotherium, the scimitar-toothed cats, were not built like the sleek, sprinting cheetahs of today. They were built like heavyweight wrestlers. They had disproportionately massive, heavily muscled forelimbs and thick claws designed for grappling. They were ambush predators and likely hunted in social groups. They didn't run their prey down. They ambushed it, swarmed it, and used sheer brute force to grapple the massive herbivore to the ground, pinning it securely to completely immobilize it.
I'm going to paint this picture clearly. It is 3 a.m. A lone steppe bison is isolated from the herd. The Homotherium pack bursts from the brush. They impact the bison with devastating force, their massive forelimbs locking onto the shoulders and flanks, dragging the beast to the frozen earth. The prey is pinned. And then the executioner moves in.
And the biomechanics of the bite are a masterpiece of horrific efficiency. The cat opens its jaws to roughly a 45-degree angle. It targets the soft flesh of the bison's belly. It presses its lower jaw, the mandible hard upward against the skin.
And the sources note something specific about that lower jaw. It wasn't smooth. The mandible possessed distinct bony flanges extending downward.
Yes. Those flanges provided structural support and allowed the lower jaw to act as an anvil. By pressing the mandible upward into the soft belly, it created a thick fold, or tent, of skin and muscle.
Then the cat drives the massive upper sabers down into that folded flesh. But because its jaw muscles are relatively weak, it doesn't just bite down, it uses its neck.
This is the crucial mechanical difference. The saber-tooth had massive, hyperdeveloped cervical musculature, specifically the cleidomastoid muscles linking the skull to the heavy shoulders. Once the sabers were sunk into the flesh, the cat didn't squeeze its jaws. It used its massive neck and forequarters to forcefully pull its entire skull violently backward and downward.
Oh wow, so it leverages the entire weight of its front half to rip backward,
tearing the massive flap of skin, muscle, and vascular tissue entirely clear of the body.
It is an instantaneous, catastrophic disembowelment. The massive systemic shock and sheer volume of blood loss would cause the prey to lose consciousness and die within minutes. But if we pull back and look at the evolutionary logic, why evolve such an incredibly specialized, risky, and messy way of killing? Why not just suffocate them quietly?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer is competitive pressure. The Ice Age Predator Guild was intensely crowded and brutally competitive. If you are a saber-toothed cat, you are sharing this pitch-black landscape with packs of dire wolves, which were heavily built, highly aggressive canids, and the giant short-faced bear.
Right, I've heard of those.
A towering, long-legged predator that relied entirely on bullying other predators off their kills. If you take 20 minutes to slowly suffocate a bison, the scent of the struggle, the fear pheromones, and the noise will attract every scavenger within a 5-mile radius. A pack of dire wolves will swarm you, force you off your kill, and steal the calories.
You expend all the metabolic energy of the hunt, but you don't get the caloric reward. You starve.
Precisely. So the saber-tooth evolved to kill as rapidly as biologically possible. Rip the belly open, let the prey bleed out in seconds, and gorge on the nutrient-dense organs immediately before the competition arrives in the dark. It was an evolutionary arms race dedicated purely to speed and blood loss.
It is a landscape defined by violence, But amidst that horror, the sources provided a detail about these cats that fundamentally altered my auditory imagination of the Ice Age. It comes from a recent 2023 study focusing on the hyoid bones.
Yes, the hyoid is a small, U-shaped complex of bones situated in the throat, suspending the larynx. Its shape and the degree to which it ossifies dictate the vocal capabilities of an animal. For decades, the assumption was that because saber-tooths were massive apex predators, they possessed the vocal structures of the modern Panthera genus.
We assumed they roared like lions.
We did. Lions have a partially cartilaginous hyoid apparatus that allows the vocal tract to stretch, producing that deep, booming roar. But the 2023 morphological analysis showed that while saber-tooths had the same number of hyoid bones as roaring cats, the specific geometry and complete ossification of those bones were structurally analogous to the Feline subfamily.
Wait, the subfamily that includes modern house cats? Which means
it is highly probable that saber-toothed cats did not roar. The rigid structure of their hyoid bones suggests they produce vocalizations through the continuous rapid twitching of their laryngeal muscles during both inhalation and exhalation.
they purred.
They purred.
I want you to sit with the psychological terror of that acoustic environment. The ambush is over, the violent tearing of the belly shear is done, the massive volume of blood is rapidly freezing on the frost-covered grass, and echoing across the eerie moonlit silence of the mammoth steppe isn't the majestic territorial roar of a lion. It is a deep, resonant, rhythmic purring. A low-frequency mechanical rumble vibrating through the dark from the chest of a 500-pound predator covered in blood.
It creates a vivid acoustic signature of a world that belongs entirely to the megafauna. The hominins are hidden deep within their rock shelters, insulated under stolen furs. The mammoths are clustered in massive defensive formations, their internal furnaces burning against the cold. And the cats own the blood-soaked plains.
But the absolute darkness cannot hold forever. The timeline shifts for the final time. It is 6:00 a.m. The relentless, biting wind begins to shift direction. The sheer blackness of the sky softens into a deep, bruised purple. The stars begin to fade. The first sharp, pale rays of blue light begin to crack the eastern horizon. Dawn is breaking over the mammoth steppe.
The 12-hour cycle overnight is ending. The sun returns, offering a brief, fractional reprieve of warmth. But we need to zoom out conceptually here, because this daily sunrise is actually a microcosm of a much larger planetary awakening. The Ice Age was not a permanent, static freeze. The Earth was not dead. It was breathing.
We are stepping into the realm of orbital mechanics. How does the Earth's movement through the vacuum of space dictate the advance and retreat of a mile-thick glacier?
It is driven by the Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian astrophysicist Milutin Milankovitch. He calculated that the Earth's orbit around the Sun is not a perfect, stable circle. It is subjected to the gravitational tug-of-war from Jupiter and Saturn. These gravitational forces cause three distinct orbital variations.
The first is eccentricity.
Yes. Over a cycle of roughly 100,000 years, the shape of the Earth's orbit stretches from nearly circular to slightly elliptical and back again. This changes the total distance between the Earth and the Sun during specific seasons.
Okay, the second is obliquity, the tilt.
The Earth spins on an axis, but that axis isn't perfectly vertical. Over a 41,000-year cycle, the axial tilt rocks back and forth between 22.1 degrees and 24.5 degrees. When the tilt is greater, the poles receive much more direct solar radiation during their respective summers.
And the third is precession, which is the wobble.
Like a spinning top that is starting to slow down, the Earth's axis wobbles, tracing a circle in the stars over a 26,000-year cycle. This dictates exactly where in the elliptical orbit the seasons occur.
And when these three incredibly slow, massive celestial cycles align in a specific configuration, it changes the fundamental math of the Earth's climate.
Milankovitch theorized that the critical factor wasn't how cold the winters got, but how warm the summers were, specifically at 35 degrees north latitude. If the orbital cycles align so that the northern hemisphere summer receives slightly less direct solar radiation called insolation, the summer isn't warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow.
And that triggers the feedback loop.
Precisely. The snow survives this summer. The next winter, more snow falls on top of it. It compacts into glacial ice. And ice is highly reflective. It increases the Earth's albedo, bouncing solar radiation back into space, which cools the planet even further. The glacier grows, reflecting more heat in a massive compounding freeze that lasts for tens of thousands of years.
But the cycles never stop turning. Eventually, the eccentricity, the tilt, and the wobble shift back into an alignment that maximizes summer insolation in the north. The sunlight intensifies.
and the ice begins to break.
Picture the morning light catching the jagged, sheer vertical edge of the Laurentide ice sheet, a wall of ancient ice stretching across the horizon of North America. The pale light hits the Johnstown Moraine, a massive, winding ridge of pulverized boulders, gravel, and earth that the glacier literally bulldozed forward during its advance. And as the global temperature warms by just a few degrees, the physics of the ice react. You hear a sound like cannon fire, the deep, thunderous structural groaning of a million-ton ice sheet shifting and fracturing. Immense columns of meltwater begin to pour from the glacial face, gouging out deep channels in the rock, forming vast temporary lakes.
The world is permanently waking up from the deep freeze. The Holocene epoch is beginning, but this dawn brings a catastrophic crisis for the giants of the steppe.
They were engineered down to their DNA for the frozen dark. What happens to the mammoth and the saber-tooth when the sun comes up and stays up?
They faced an environmental collapse they simply could not adapt to. As the climate warmed, the glaciers retreated, and massive volumes of water flooded back into the oceans, raising sea levels. The incredibly dry, high-pressure systems that maintained the lowest plains collapsed. The mammoth steppe became warmer and significantly wetter.
Which destroyed the grasses.
The tough, nutritious sedges that sustained the mammoths were rapidly outcompeted by encroaching forests, sprawling peat bogs, and deep mosses. The mammoth's endless caloric horizon literally vanished beneath their feet, their habitat fragmented, shrinking into isolated pockets in the extreme north.
But the shifting climate wasn't the only pressure. They were also dealing with a biological pressure that had spent the last 50,000 years perfecting its ability to kill.
They were dealing with us. Homo sapiens had spent the deep freeze in an evolutionary crucible. We perfected our composite tools, our at-walls, our highly coordinated social structures, and our hunting strategies. As the weather warmed, human populations rapidly expanded and pushed deep into these shrinking megafaunal refuges. The animals were already severely stressed by starvation, habitat loss, and declining birth rates. The addition of highly organized, persistent human hunting acted as the final pressure that pushed them past the breaking point.
The saber-tooths, adapted to hunt massive, slow-moving herbivores in the dark, lost their primary prey base and starved. The woolly mammoths were hunted down, their populations collapsing until only a few isolated, highly inbred populations remained on islands like Wrangel before fading entirely.
The age of the giants was over. The sunrise killed the monsters, but it yielded the Holocene entirely to us.
And that brings our chronological journey to a close. We have survived the 12-hour night. We have tracked the thermodynamic miracles of the mammoth's mutated blood, mapped the cognitive genius of the Neanderthal hearths at Torforage, survived the brutal mathematics of brown fat and animal pelts, listened to the vibrating terror of a purring saber-tooth, and witnessed the orbital mechanics that melted a continent of ice. So what does this all mean?
It is a narrative of absolute, uncompromising resilience. It strips away our modern illusions of comfort and reminds us that human survival was never a given. It was carved out of the frost through biological adaptation, architectural ingenuity, and the sheer stubborn will to endure the dark.
But the Ice Age isn't just a closed chapter of natural history. It didn't vanish into the ether when the glaciers melted. It left permanent, indelible scars on the physical stage of our world. The lowest dust that was ground down by the glaciers and blown across the mammoth steppe. That dust eventually settled, forming the deep, incredibly fertile topsoils of the American Midwest and the Eurasian breadbasket. The retreating ice sheets gouged massive trenches into the bedrock and filled them with meltwater, creating the Great Lakes. The glaciers literally fertilized and terraformed the ground upon which our modern agricultural civilization is built.
And more profoundly, the Ice Age lives on within our own bodies. It is written into our genome. It lives in the brown adipose tissue that activates to keep our infants warm. It lives in our complex social instincts to huddle together, to share resources, and to build community when the environment turns hostile.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to carry into your evening. Think about the feeling you get when you step out of a freezing winter night into a warm house, and you wrap a thick, heavy blanket over your shoulders. Or think about that mesmerizing, almost hypnotic trance you fall into when you stare deeply into the glowing, shifting coals of a crackling campfire. That deep, instinctual sense of peace and comfort you feel in those moments. No ellipses. That deep, instinctual sense of peace and comfort you feel in those moments. It isn't just a cozy modern preference, it is a biological echo. It is the genetic memory of your ancestors, breathing a collective sigh of relief. It is a profound survival reflex forged in the smoke of torforage, echoing across tens of thousands of freezing nights on the mammoth steppe.
You are the descendant of the ones who possess the ingenuity to make it to sunrise.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Pleistocene night. We wish you a warm, safe, and deeply restful sleep.